Welcome to Beyond the Vote, a discussion of women in leadership, hosted by the Christian Science Monitor. I'm Noelle Swan, Deputy Editor of the Monitor Daily. Thanks so much for joining us today as we commemorate the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote in the United States. So this month, the Monitor has marked this momentous occasion, centennial really, with twin suffrage-themed editions of the Christian Science Monitor weekly magazine and the Monitor Daily. This series is a tribute to the moral courage of the suffragists, the subsequent struggles to advance equal rights for women that shaped the past century, and today's modern pioneers pushing for a more equitable society. Before we meet our panelists, let me quickly introduce you to Dave Scott, the Monitor's audience engagement editor.
Hi, everybody. We would love to have you participate by sending in your questions and comments during this event. To submit a question, click on the Q&A icon, which is kind of at the bottom right of your Zoom screen, and then just type in your question. I'll be monitoring your questions and comments while the panelists are talking, and I'll be back later in the program to share them. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Well, today I am really thrilled to introduce all of you to three remarkable women, all of whom were featured in our series. Jane Curtis of Woodstock, Vermont, was a toddler when women won the right to vote. She has since spent a lifetime pushing for social and environmental justice. Celeste Montoya is an associate professor of women and gender studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Her research focuses on how women and marginalized groups enact change. Nwabisa Makung is the editor-in-chief of the Sowetan, one of South Africa's most circulated daily newspapers. And for the first half of our program, we're going to have a panel discussion with Jane, Celeste, and Nwabisa, and then we'll be opening this up for discussion, answering some of your questions as well. But I'd like to start off with a bit of a story, and I'm hoping that Nwabisa can help me out with that. So Monitor readers first met Nwabisa in a Ryan Lenora Brown story on the rise of women in leadership in South Africa's major media companies. So Nwabisa, for that piece, you shared a story with Ryan about the precise moment that you decided to become a journalist. It had to do with finding someone who looked like you to look up to. Would you mind sharing that with us today?
Of course. Hi, Noah, and thank you so much for inviting me. So for me, I mean, I remember precisely, I was 11 years old, living, here at home in South Africa. And anybody who knows South Africa, you know, we had quite a rough apartheid history. So there was a man called Chris Hani, who an anti-apartheid struggle hero. He was assassinated, unfortunately, in 1993. And so his funeral was basically broadcast, live on TV. And I remember it was a very emotional time for South Africans. I mean, my parents included, and everyone of us. And I remember that particular day sitting, basically I was sitting on the floor of my parents' living room, and we were all watching this funeral. And as I say, it's quite emotional. But there was a woman who was basically anchoring the program that day. She was absolutely phenomenal. Her name was Noelle Swan, who is one of South Africa's most veteran TV anchors. And one of the things that really caught me, besides the emotions of the day, it was really about how she was telling a story. So here was this woman who basically looked like me. She's a woman, she's Black, and she's telling a story of this remarkable man in a way that, not only kind of got us to understand who this person was, but in a way that really moved us, that moved us as a nation. And I think for me, it was just in that moment I sat and I thought to myself, this is what I want to do. You know, I didn't even register. It didn't even register to me as any kind of journalism or anything of the sort. It was really about, I want to tell stories for a living. I don't know what it means. I don't know how. I don't know where I'm going. I mean, I was 11 years old, as I said, you know. But for me, it was precisely that. I wanted to tell stories for a living. And so growing up and kind of pursuing, you know, a career in journalism, it was birthed from that moment, in my view.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that with me. And the reason I wanted to get into that is I hear that idea again and again from just my friends, women in my life, my female colleagues, that having a role model, seeing a woman that you can look up to, and having someone that you can aspire to emulate really just makes such a huge difference. So I wonder, Jane and Celeste, if there were women in your lives who, when you were growing up, maybe when you were children or as young adults, who really kind of helped to stretch your idea of what a woman might be. Celeste, would you mind starting?
So I think that there have been so many examples, not necessarily one that stands out. I come from a family of really strong women, both Latina and Italian American, and they've always played a central part in our family. And so I've always been taught that I can, you know, reach for my goals and my dreams, and really encouraged to do that. And so I think they set a really strong example. But I think sometimes just as influential are the times when I haven't had role models. You know, definitely, you know, growing up, there were lots of them, but then there were also moments like when I was in graduate school, when there weren't a lot of other Latinos around, or Latina women examples. And it was when I started networking and reaching out and finding those people who weren't necessarily always in front of me, that kind of helped me to get through those moments, when I wasn't given the opportunity to see, like, oh yes, I can do this, like this can be me. Those moments of doubt, that when I've been able to reach out and find those networks through a Latino caucus, or, you know, at other universities, that's been really pivotal. And so sometimes I think about the moments when there haven't been examples, when there haven't been Latinas in the leadership or in the spotlight to emulate, and how important it is when they are there, when they do show up, when they are given a voice and are able to lead. So I think sometimes, you know, the role models are so influential, but their absence is notable when they're missing from certain venues.
So I wonder if sort of experiencing that absence and having to really go out and search for these people has changed how you think of yourself as a role model. I think that's a tough hat for us to put on, to take the transition from being someone who wants a role model to being one. Did you feel like you needed to take that on sooner than you might have because of that difficulty in finding them yourself?
Absolutely. In fact, you know, I direct a program that's for first generation and underrepresented students, that has a lot of Latino students here in Colorado. And you know, it's always been important to introduce myself when I'm in the front of the classroom as Dr. Montoya. It's really easy for students to say, you know, well, this is Miss Montoya or the Celeste, right? Get overly familiar. And to say no, it was a struggle to get here. And it's important to have somebody to show you that this path is possible. And so so I know that when I have to put on my Dr. Montoya hat, that it's meaningful, that it's not just meaningful to me, but it might be meaningful to the student who is the first person in their family to go to college, or who has really never thought of an academic route, in being a figure, being a producer of knowledge. And so so I'm very cognizant of that. And so it also helps me to get through my moments of self-doubt, right? That I know that I have to lead by example, and to lead by example, I have to kind of push down that imposter syndrome and say, no, I deserve to be here. You deserve to be here. And so, so I think about that a lot. And sometimes I feel like I'm too young to be that role model, but when there aren't that many examples, you know, in front of you, or they're few and far between, you quickly take on that mentorship role for those that are coming right after you.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that. I want to get back to that idea of imposter syndrome later. But for now, I want to turn over to Jane. How about you? I mean, growing up, who did you look up to? Who helped you sort of envision what a woman could be?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand you being old and deaf.
No, that's quite all right, Jane. I'm wondering, so when you were growing up, were there women in your life that you looked up to and helped you to realize who you might be able to become?
I grew up in a family of extremely powerful women, terrifyingly at times. And I had one ancestor of mine who was put in jail because she wouldn't accept Yankee money. She was a Tory. So I come from a sort of a Tory thing of being a woman doing what you damn well want to do. And nobody's going to stop you. And my mother was the same way, and my grandmother. So I come by it through inheritance. It just makes me absolutely furious when I'm told I can't do something because I'm a woman.
Well, that's great that you had sort of that inspiration from the beginning. I think society may not have necessarily felt that way. So, Jane, have you noticed in your lifetime how have you seen sort of attitudes shift around women?
I think it is vastly improved since I grew up. I'm 103 years old. You know, that's what 3 generations back. But how it has changed, and I'm so proud of what women are doing. I think fine, we're getting there. We're getting there. We're almost there.
We're almost there. That is a really nice thing to hear. Certainly a nice sentiment. So that trajectory for progress for women in society has not always been necessarily equal, and the trajectory for white women and for women of color, not just in the United States but around the world, has often progressed in these two different tracks and following it at very different rates. But today we're starting to see we've really seen those things merge together, and that's been a big source of hope for a lot of observers, particularly in looking at some of the social justice movements that are going on right now, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the many spin-offs of that movement that we're seeing around the world. I wonder, Celeste, so how does this racial and gender diversity, how does it change the flavor of the movement, and why is it really so important to the BLM and the current civil rights movements?
Well, I think it's really important when we have social movements to, part of a social movement is this collective action, this idea that we're coming together, that there's a unified front to overcome oppression, right? Oppression is not something that's easily overturned. It's often not just even the inequalities of the day, but decades, centuries of oppression that need to be overturned. So you need to have a big united effort to do that. But so often we get caught up in focusing on that message of unity and overlooking the differences that exist, and how different experiences with oppression matter and are important. And if we're only coming from it from one direction, it's usually a false unity. If we're just focusing on gender, we're not talking about how there are different gendered experiences. And so that you need to be able to pay attention to those differences in order to have a successful movement that truly is built on true solidarity, on this true solidarity that is big enough to overcome. A lot of times when we see social movements fall apart, it's because people feel like they're no longer being represented by the movement. And that's often happened when we've had these single dimension movements that are just about class, or just about gender, or just about sexuality, or even just about race, right? That if we're not talking about how there are different experiences within that, then we're not fully addressing the problems. And so it's so important to do that. And it's really heartening to start to see social movements mainstream social movements paying more attention to that. There have always been activists, including in the suffrage movement, who knew that you couldn't disentangle that you needed to tackle racial and gender inequality at the same time. Otherwise, you risk just partial victories, and partial victories that are not only helping some people, but might actually be actively hurting others, which was very much a part of the suffrage narrative, is that there were women willing to trade off in order to achieve their rights. They were willing to feed into the oppression of others. And so if we're truly focused on liberation and equality and freedom and all the promises that are supposed to be a part of a democracy, then we need to have this more inclusive and more intersectional picture of what that actually means.
It does seem like the current movements are at least starting to be more multi-layered, and starting to really incorporate more of those experiences. And as with anything, this is a process, and it's never going to just happen immediately. But were there any particular turning points that started to make that happen more, or maybe brought some of these? I mean, you mentioned the suffrage movement. You kind of had two tracks that came out of that. At some point, it does seem like they've come back together, but I don't really have a clear sense of what brought them back together.
I think women of color leadership has been so integral to that, right? That we have these women who are often being asked by racial justice movements or women's movements to pick what's more important to you. And there's been this refusal to do that, right? That you can't just portion off part of yourself. And so those groups, those women have always been so key and so central to building these coalitions between movements. And as they've moved more into more central, as their leadership positions have been more recognized within contemporary movements, you see them bringing that sensibility that used to be kind of separate, bringing it to the forefront. And I think that that's been huge. That if we look back at history, often women of color leadership is erased. That we see a whitewashing of movements. That we see kind of we're not bringing the full range of all the activism that was present. And now we see that that women of color are no longer, they've been successful in creating spaces for themselves, not just between movements, but more centrally within those mainstream movements. And I think that that's been a big part of it. I think sometimes some of the events that happen, the election of Donald Trump certainly brought a lot of different social justice movements to the forefront,
Sure.
because they saw it as a threat. And so that was one way to kind of bring some of those different movements together.
All right, that's really a helpful perspective. Thank you, Celeste. Nwabisa, I bet you have a thing or two to share about the importance of making room for diverse voices in public discourse. So just for background for our audience, nearly half of South Africa's major publications and broadcasters are women, and most of them are Black, Asian, and multiracial. And so that's particularly remarkable for South Africa, given that a generation ago, the nation was gripped by apartheid. So how has the rise of women, particularly women of color, into these leadership positions, how has that changed the nature of public discourse in the country?
Well, Noelle, I think it's definitely changed in areas that we as women deem as very important. So I wanna answer this question by making one particular example. So South Africa, and I think a lot of people know, South Africa is a very violent country, unfortunately. And part of that violence is really gender-based violence. So there's a very deep kind of culture of women being beaten, being killed, raped, and all sorts of things happening to us. And I think, it has always been the case, right? It has always been, a country where that happens to women. But I think in the last, say, 5-6 years or so, it's really kind of moved from being, a story of crime necessarily to really about, being a far more focused story about what exactly is happening, the nature of the crime. So not just the fact that, somebody was beaten up, but the fact that, there is a culture that feeds into making it acceptable for men to have women. And I think part of that, it's really been two things in my view. The fact that women generally, whether on social media, whether in different spaces of discourse, have really kind of stood up to say enough is enough. And then I think in the newsroom, what we've done, is really kind of move that from a story that's on the periphery to really becoming very mainstream, to say, this is the story that we need to cover, this is what we need to talk about as a nation. And I think for me, that has been quite an important shift that we've seen, particularly in our news coverage. And also peeling off the layers that really make one understand why is this happening. So a lot of patriarchal cultures exist in our society, misogyny, and in all of that. Those things, in my view, so it's not just about the acts of violence, but what actually feeds into the acts of violence. And I think we've begun to tell those stories in a far more way with depth. In a far more, a way that resonates, with a lot of women and their own experiences.
Well, thank you, Nwabisa, for sharing that perspective. I want to circle back to an idea that Celeste brought up about imposter syndrome, and I think everyone is familiar with imposter syndrome. It's something that we all deal with, and Celeste shared a little bit about how she deals with that. Jane, it sounds like you were told from a very young age that you could do anything you wanted to. How do you sort of keep quiet those little voices in your head that may disagree with that?
Well, as I said, I grew up in an extremely patriarchal New England family where men told women what to do. But I had my mother and my grandmother and some ancestors that maybe they were going to do it right, overtly. Took time for them to get their courage up to do exactly what they wanted to, and to shock the rest of our society at what they did do. I must say I'm proud of them. But I guess that's in my, yes, Kate. Oh yes, Kate reminded me. I was named for Joan of Arc, named for Jane of John, the same thing. And I was named for that. My mother was very much, as I said, a feminist, and she said you want to look at Joan of Arc. So I was given the book, The Bells of Domremy, when I was first reading about Joan of Arc. And the first thing I did, very lucky to go to France when I was quite young. And the first thing my mother and my father took me was to see Joan of Arc on her horse with her sword leading the French army. And so I said, by golly, she's my girl. So I'm following Joan as Woodstock as far as I can go.
That's great. Jane, do you have any advice for young women about sort of how to maintain their own courage? They don't all have Joan of Arc to look up to.
That we're twice as smart as most of the men, and we can do what we want to do, and to hell with them. I've had these men tell me I can't do that because I'm a woman. Well, I'll be polite and not say what I said. But damn it, we are tough people and we can do it. And I hate to have, we are given something. We're given the right to vote. It makes me furious, we won the right to vote. So there I am, cross.
That idea of women being tough,
Yeah.
that's a hard one for a lot of women to own. That idea, I mean, is I guess how important is that to sort of to be able to see yourself as being strong? And I mean,
I have to say that attributed to loss of luck. I have to be honest about that. I was born in an interesting family that didn't like what I proposed to do, but didn't kick me out of the family. And I have a daughter who's just taking it another step further, and she's going to, God knows what she's going to be doing when she's my age. I can just see it. And yeah, you have to fight. And I don't want to say we are given something. We won it. We have to fight. You know, it's easy. You know, we are as strong as they are, but I think we're twice as smart as most of the men. Yeah, I said my say.
All right. Well, thank you, Jane. Sometimes imposter syndrome doesn't necessarily come from within. It's sometimes put on us. And Nwabisa, as an executive, have you ever encountered a feeling where you are a female figurehead who's gotten where you are because of your gender, and how have you been able to reject that idea for yourself? I mean, it's one thing to just answer people who say that. It's another not to let it become something that eats at you.
Yeah. So for me, I think, so two things. So the one thing is, I mean, we talk about strength and women being strong. And personally, I don't know if I would, for myself, attribute it to strength. I mean, I always feel, you know, imposter syndrome all the time, at any given point in my career, at any given point, you know, in my life. And I think, you know, overcoming it, I wouldn't necessarily, for me, you know, put it to strength, but rather the knowledge that I am able, I am willing, and I am determined to do something. So there's always a reason why I mean, I want to do this. So when I started off and I talked about the women who inspired me to tell stories, of course I didn't know, you know, how to tell stories, and I didn't know how to basically do this thing. But I think, you know, as one grows, you know that one, you've seen this, you've seen somebody who looks like you, who've done this, and you're thinking to yourself, you actually are, you're able. So, and that ability has to be something that is trained, you know, so you self-teach, and you get everything that you can to actually empower yourself to do that. So for me, you know, on the one hand, it's always been that, but also it's very important, I think, particularly for us as women, to create environments where people who come after us feel that they actually belong. And I've been fortunate in that I've had leaders, some of them were men, in fact, most of them were men, but they did create an environment for me where even if it's just one person, you know, who always kind of said, you know, come along, you know, you should be here. Even when you make mistakes, it's okay, get up and go, you know, because you should be here, because you do understand why you need to do what you need to do. So it's a mental game. You know, for me, it's absolutely a mental game, but I don't think it's one of strength necessarily. It's just knowing that, you know, this is what I need to do, and this is what I'm going to do as a result.
Well, it sounds like it's as much about confidence and resilience for you as it is for sort of brute strength, which our temperaments all gravitate to different areas here. I want to give Celeste a chance to talk a little bit about how she deals with this as well. But after that, I think we'll be switching to audience questions and starting to take some of those. So if you have any, please go ahead and start typing those in, and Dave will be collating those for us and moving the discussion along. But Celeste, how are you? I know you touched on this a little bit in your earlier answer, but maybe after hearing a bit from Jane and Nwabisa, are there other ideas about how women can sort of help to get rid of this imposter syndrome, or at least quiet it?
Well, I think that there are a lot of, well, in speaking to the kind of the themes of leadership, I think that there are a lot of different forms of leadership, but we don't always get to see them. Like there are these ideal types that tend to be masculine. And so when we're talking about strength, we're often talking about kind of masculine forms of strength. But there are so many different strengths that people have that can be other sorts of gendered performances, right? That can, you know, having empathy is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength, right? And so what are some of the characteristics that are often deemed as feminine, that are demeaned and seen as weak, which actually could be positive forms of leadership? And so one of the ways that I deal with imposter syndrome is also to think about that, to think about how, you know, the person who is the most effective leader is not always the strongest, loudest person, you know, in the room, the person who's constantly talking, but sometimes it's the person who listens, who truly sees and hears people, who's able to try to understand what it is that they're dealing with, and then able to motivate them and able to help them live to their own potential, right? That these are different models of leadership that are more effective than some of the ways that we've been traditionally thought. And those are the types of things where, you know, people can start to see like, hey, I can do this, right? These are the strengths that I bring to the table. These are the ways in which I'm able to work with my team and motivate them. And that if more women, you know, were able to do that, if more people were able to see that there doesn't have to be this prototypical idea of what a leader looks like, that we can have many different leaders and many different leadership styles, that I think that that's a really effective means of pushing past that imposter syndrome, to see what it is that you bring to the table, what knowledge, what experiences, what humanity and compassion you can bring to that. And so those are the things that I look for, you know, in my students too, like, and to let them know, right, that it's not always the person who always has their hand raised and seems particularly confident. Sometimes it's the student who is getting other people to talk, who, you know, is empowering them to do that. That's the type of leadership that can really change the world. And that's, I think, the type of leadership that we're really in need of right now, not only in this country, but elsewhere. And we're really starting to see that. We're starting to see who has the compassion to see the suffering people are doing, you know, are going through, and is able to come up with solutions to that. And yeah, that's I think we
That's
need
really
this
helpful.
bottom-up.
No, I think that is really helpful to think about strength in different ways. And, you know, much of what you were saying is it actually points to some of the things that Nwabisa mentioned, as saying, I don't think of these as being about strength. They are a kind of strength. It's a different kind. And it is really interesting to think about just sort of the different kinds of qualities that that can be brought to leadership roles. We've been so used to seeing one particular form of them. Before I pass it over to Dave, I'm hearing that I'm getting one question about my previous question, which is just, could we just define imposter syndrome? So this is the idea, the sense that many of us, it's not just women, everyone kind of feels when you are in a position and you start to doubt yourself and doubt how you ended up getting that position, whether you truly deserve it and whether you are capable of delivering on that. So it's just sort of this imposter syndrome is just kind of a term that has been tossed around in recent years. And as people have started to talk about these doubts a little bit more and started to realize, wait a minute, it's not just me. Everybody feels this way. And so it's really nice to hear how the three of you think about these things and really try and sort of quiet those doubts and really bolster your own sense of self and self-confidence. But so let's bring Dave up on screen so that we can start to hear some more questions from the audience. Hi, Dave.
Yeah. Hello, and thank you all for writing in. I've got a mere 72 questions and comments to go through, so talk fast, all right? Now, there's several questions that have come in about the battle that their parents, their mothers or their grandmothers faced growing up. For example, Ruth wrote in, my mother was just a little younger than you, Jane, when she had to fight her way against barriers for women. And she was the first woman to be admitted in the PhD program, physics program at NIT. And then finding employment was very difficult and discouraging for her. And several other women wrote about this challenge of finding work in an environment that was very difficult. How, Jane, did you manage that challenge?
I think I just, to hell with them. I wanted to do that, so I'm going to do it. And I wasn't cut off at the legs. I survived. I think you just had to say, I'm going to do this, and it's too bad it's not ladylike. I should be home knitting or something, but I'm not. I'm out here because I'm cross about something that has to be fixed. I remember going down to Washington with the women, lots of women against nuclear proliferation. It was a huge success. And I realized then how powerful women were and how if we get together and get set on something we want to do, by golly, we could pull it off. And we have to keep thinking about that and not letting things dissuade us from doing that. And there are plenty of dissuaders, I can tell you.
Jane, did you feel like you had to prove something?
I'm sorry?
Did you feel like you had to prove something about what you could do?
I have a mother who and a grandmother who did exactly what they wanted to do, and they were shocking. I mean, they really were. What is Mrs. Bacon doing now? She lived an extremely interesting life, and my mother did too. And my father was a very gentle man. And Dorothy, if you want, that's what you want to do, go right ahead, Dorothy, which she did. And she made a success of her life in many ways. So I had those two women there who I had to live up to them. You had to follow their
related. Sorry, Jane, go ahead.
You had to follow in their steps. It's important. I'm furious when I hear people saying the women are given the vote. Damn it, they weren't given it. We had to fight for it. Furious about that. We got to, it's so easy to lie back and let somebody else do it, but if we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it except ourselves.
We're still fighting for it, so.
Yes.
I have a question here for Nwabisa. What were the enablers and obstacles to your advancement to become editor of the Sowetan? And what challenges do you feel like you face now?
Definitely. So I think challenges right now is probably a global challenge. I think it's really kind of doing more with less. The South African economy is a very difficult one. We all know basically the economic story of what has happened to journalism. But I think the challenge is which is also quite exciting, is really, to kind of tell stories in a new way, in a way that people are wanting, in a way that is convenient for people, that people are wanting, rather than, kind of traditional forms of doing journalism that we've always been accustomed to for, however many years. And I think for me, that's kind of, the big challenge right now. But I think for me personally, in the job, yes, of course, there've been, many obstacles. I spoke, for example, about a scourge of gender-based violence in South Africa. And although I have not necessarily been a victim of that precisely, but I think one of the challenges that one faces are things like sexual harassment and those kinds of things. And when you're kind of trying to do your job, and I'm not even talking in the corporate itself, but basically when you're out there trying to report and how people see you. So before they actually see a journalist, they see a woman that they may want to get on with. And so to try to push that, to say, actually, I'm here as a professional to do my job, and kind of put those things aside and continue to move on. So those are kind of some of the challenges that, that we're facing, not just myself, but I think, anybody who looks like me, who does the kind of job that I do.
And Jane, we have several more questions here and a number of questions around the role of men. And one specifically was to Jane, in a family where you have very strong women, tell me about the men in the family. Were they supportive or did they just get left behind?
They were supportive and they did not get left behind. They were right up there encouraging me, certainly, and my mother. My mother had a wonderful life. She did what she wanted to do, and he wanted to do it too. So they had rather extraordinary time together. They were a role model for me. And I think of the women who married the the man who wouldn't let the woman be. And I hate also the idea of we are given something. Damn it, we fought for it, as I said before, we fought for it there. And we also had men who were stood behind us and let us fight. And that made it easier for me. I had men who said, go ahead, Jane. You know, go and make a fool of yourself. It was okay with me.
Well, Jane, I love the idea that that women didn't need men's permission; they needed to take it.
Yes.
But it does seem that true progress for women has included needing men to start to see women differently as well. Have you seen? I mean, how have you seen that change?
I think I have, yes, I have seen it change. I certainly have seen that their partners is one man is leading, the man is leading, the other woman following along and being the good housewife. The women are right there with the men, right beside them, or even leading them on to whatever it is has to be done to make society for everybody better. And I think the idea that women are given something is infuriating. We took it and we earned it, and it should be ours. It should have always been ours. And it is now much better than it was when I grew up. Much, much better. I'm encouraged.
I have a question here from Glenna. What are the characteristics of feminine leadership as distinct from masculine leadership? And we also had a question too about the Democratic Party here in the United States having a vice presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, and what influence that might have. So it's sort of related questions, but let's start with the masculine versus feminine qualities of leadership. Any one of the panelists can jump in on that.
I can speak to that. So a lot of the studies that look at gender and leadership talk about there being kind of those traditional models, right, that can be more masculine in nature. They can be more competitive. They can be more hierarchical. That, you know, it very much is kind of a command sort of leadership. And that doesn't mean that all men have that style. It just kind of means it's more of a masculine form of it. And then more feminine forms of leadership tend to be a little bit more cooperative, tend to be more, there are studies of state houses that show that women are more likely than men to reach across the aisle to come up with a compromise between the parties, that there's more of this collaborative environment, that's what a more feminine, and like I said, that also doesn't just belong to women. There can be men who take kind of that form of leadership as well. And so you know, those are the types of things that kind of draw on what we traditionally think of men and women. That's when we're talking about masculine and feminine is what, you know, and those different forms of strength. So the feminine forms of leadership really are more about listening, about serving, about caregiving, about nurturing. And we see that also in terms of differences in policies, like which policies are women more likely to support, to promote, to advocate on behalf of, education, healthcare, right? That there are sometimes even just different types of you know, versus, you know, different issues that might come up, more about the, you know, the economic performance and trade and war, right? And so there are these differences that can come about.
David, can I just jump in there as well, if you don't mind?
Please, go ahead, Noelle.
So I most certainly agree with Celeste. I think sort of our experience here and really what happens in, you know, in corporate South Africa is that we've seen, you know, attributes where women, for example, will be far more concerned with why things happen rather than just, you know, this needs to happen and we need to get to a goal. So I've found, you know, a lot of our peers, for example, whenever there's a particular story that we need to cover. So we're covering the story, yes, but also we understand, you know, it being quite a layered story than just, you know, the fact that something has happened. And so why, you know, why it needs to happen and why you know, how it's interconnected to everything else that we do. And I think also we've been very deliberate, you know, in fighting for things like representation, particularly because we understand that we need to create an environment where we feel like we belong. Whereas men, for example, if you walk into, you know, into any boardroom here, you know, you walk in, yes, you need to perform. If you're not performing, then you're out. But here, I think for us as women, you know, there's always a question about why is she not performing? You know, what are the things that perhaps may influence, you know, a lack of productivity? And is there a way that we need to help this person to, you know, to become better than, you know, just kind of to mark them, okay, you're not performing, you know, out the way, or that kind of thing. So I think it's those, sometimes I've seen that, you know, those may be the differences. Again, they're not solely, you know, men and women. I mean, they're men, you know, who are far more, you know, better at women, you know, than better at it than women. But I still think that, you know, they're traits that are more expressed by women than so men.
Well, I can't help but think that the expansion of leadership, of the idea of leadership to include more of these traditionally feminine values and attributes can actually also be an opportunity for many men as well, because not all men are going to fit into that sort of stereotypical sort of picture of what a leader has to be. And you know, it seems that the more diversity in general, in so many ways we can get of leadership, the more nuanced we're gonna see in our leaders, and the more different kinds of leaders we're gonna have. Sorry, that was a comment, not a question. But
So we have a lot of collective wisdom here today, and I have a question here from Sarah, who has an 11-year-old granddaughter, who thinks that because women have achieved so much, we're there. What would you each tell an 11-year-old that can resonate with her? Her name is Ava, or AVA, and she's listening.
If I may, I think I'd tell, hi Ava, I think I'll tell Ava what I tell my 11-year-old son, which is that, you know, her voice matters. And I think it's one of the things, it may seem quite a simple thing, but for me, it's something that was very profound, because it was only when I understood that not only do I matter, but what I think and what I have to say actually matters. And that I do deserve people actually sitting back and listening and saying, okay, you know, and basically engaging, regardless of whatever the context, you know, we're talking about. So the understanding that you matter, the understanding that you're voice matter, and you need to basically cap regardless of, you know, what you're facing, what you're told. Of course, I mean, you behave. I mean, you know, I'm not saying kind of be overly radical, but I think it's very important, in my view, to tell, particularly young people of that age, you know, and teach them to be able to say, you need to be able to speak up. You need to understand that your voice actually matters.
So I have an 11-year-old daughter, and so we have lots of conversations. She's definitely a very strong, very much a leader. She's very much active and engaged and confident. But I think it's important for me to share with her stories that are outside of her experience, because it would be easy for her to see, you know, that women can do anything, which I am trying to give her that message, that she can be whoever she wants to be. But that there are people that are still struggling, that are still challenging, that don't always have the support systems, that are dealing with issues that she doesn't have to deal with because of who she is. And to share those stories so that she can understand them, and that she knows that she can use her voice to fight for them and with them. And so she has a really strong sense of fairness, right? And so if she was ever told that she couldn't do something, she would definitely, just the way Jane is saying, like, well, I can do it if I want to, right? That nobody's gonna stop me. But for her to see that, that not all people are put in a position to where that sometimes the opposition, the obstacles are not so easily overcome, that people are dealing with violence. And people are still denied some very basic rights that are promised within this country and outside of it. And that, that it's not enough to sit back, that that it's our responsibility when we do have that confidence, when we do have that power, when we do have that position, to make sure that that everybody does. And so for me, sharing the stories, the very real stories of people with different experiences, is a really key part of me getting her to understand that there's still a lot of battles and challenges that lie ahead. And if she's not dealing with them now, she might be dealing with them later.
And Jane, as a young girl, we have a question here. Do you remember the first time that you stood up for a cause, as a maybe as a child, or at what point did you begin you stepping out and being an activist?
I think I grew up, I loved to sail. And I felt I was in command of things there. It was my sailboat, I was doing it, I made the decisions. And that was very empowering for me, that feeling that I was not listening to somebody else. I'm heading for that corner of that cove over there, and I'm going to attack to get there. I'm going to do it myself. That was very empowering for me. And the other thing I did was go down to see the huge meeting down in Washington, the proliferation of nuclear power. And I saw the women there, and who, if it was, a very powerful woman, who was leading the fight against the proliferation of something new to us. We didn't know how dangerous it was, but we were scared of it. And there was place with thousands and thousands of women. And I thought, wow, we aren't just little one person sitting around in a cave someplace. We can get together, and by golly, we can make our voices heard. And I think that's it, make your voices heard. We have something to say, and we damn well should say it.
We have several readers here that a related question asking about, okay, the right to vote, but what's the forefront? Where should the battles be now in terms of equality? Should it be pay? Is it reproductive rights? What are the issues that each of you see as the most important?
I'm going to stand up here and say, is my body, I have the right to say what's going to happen to it. I'm absolutely infuriated the idea that somebody else is going to tell me what I can do with my body.
I think it's important to remember that
I'll march anywhere to say that.
I think it's important to remember, though, that the fight for the right to vote is not over, that there are still people that are being impeded from exercising that right, that there have been a lot of restrictive voting policies that have been adopted in recent years that are disproportionately impacting communities of color, but also women. Some of these strict voter ID policies that have been adopted in states mean that women have had to go through extra hurdles to exercise the vote, because maybe, women are more likely to change their name when they get married or they get divorced. And so maybe their ID doesn't match up what's on the voter polls. And so it's important to remember that sometimes when we have these restrictive policies, we talk a lot about how they have a racial impact, and that's really important, but it also has a gendered impact. And so there are people who in this situation, in a pandemic, are going to have the challenge of how are they able to mail in the vote, their ballot? How are they going to get to the polling station? How are they going to get to the box where they can drop off their ballot? That's a big issue. There are so many different things that we take for granted, that it's been 100 years of women's right to vote. But during that time, we've had really restrictive practices that have prohibited women, and that's still very much an issue today. And so we can't get lax and say that, those aren't an issue anymore and these are what we're moving on to. It's very essential, and they're the types of rights that affect everything else, including those reproductive rights that Jane is talking about. If we can't exercise the right to vote, and if we aren't fighting for other people to exercise their right, then we're not going to be able to have a voice in these other policy issues.
I think for me, interestingly enough, in South Africa, right to vote for us is not the problem. our constitution is, is what it is. But the interesting thing for me, for us, is that there are two particular things that, for me, I think are most pertinent to South African women, particularly Black South African women. So it is our economy, so economic suffering, as well as violence. Those two particular things, I think, will probably, if you speak to any South African woman, will be, uppermost important. And they, even though our policies, our government policies, the public policies are very progressive. I mean, our constitution is seen, in the world as one of the best in the world. But having still said that, in practice, Black women in this country are still very much at the bottom, of the barrel when it comes to a things. And violence and poverty becomes very intertwined, in our case. So I think for me, if I were to kind of raise the flag for anything, it would be those two particular things, that we need economic freedom and we need a violent-free society.
Nwabisa, I'm glad you raised that, because a number of people have asked about violence against women in South Africa. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on where you see progress there happening and why you see progress happening.
If I were to say there's progress, the only progress in my view that we see is that we are speaking as women, and men, by the way, we are speaking more about the violence. So it's something that we are confronting at the very least with our voices. Where I'm not seeing progress, however, is when it comes to, for example, law enforcement. It comes to actually, protecting women, and stopping the scourge of violence against us. For there, even though, a lot of promises are being made, I don't necessarily see progress in that regard. What I see progress is that the conversation has changed. So now men are being challenged, which was never happening before. Men are being challenged to actually hold each other accountable. So even, for example, when we protest in our placards, it's no longer, a thing that says, a woman was raped because of how she was wearing, but our bodies are not inviting, violence. So we shouldn't be raped, we shouldn't be beaten, regardless of what we're wearing, regardless of where we're walking, regardless of where we are. And I think for me, that has become kind of the shift, in the conversation, which is good progress. However, when it comes to actually protecting women and actually ensuring that those who do, beat or kill women are actually held accountable, there's very few of that happening.
Good. We have a question from another young woman here. Her name is Meg. She's 14. She asks, how important is the Emerge movement in the United States? This is about getting women politicians elected.
Emerge.
I think it's really important to support a more diverse leadership. That I think as you get more people, more voices, more experiences, then we're truly going to be able to move closer to the ideals of what democracy is going to be. So I think it is important to encourage it. There's, some research that show that, when you look at boys and girls in kindergarten, they might be equally likely to say, I'm going to run for president. But when you look at middle school and high school, that you start to see some big, huge disparities, that young women are less likely to think that they are capable of leadership. And there's lots of examples of that in the workforce too, is that women are less likely to apply for promotions and advocate for themselves. And, part of that being that imposter syndrome. And so having programs that are really proactively encouraging groups that are being left behind, that are not as likely to stand up for themselves and to promote, I think is an important step towards getting a country that truly reflects what the population looks like.
I have a question here about the role of indigenous peoples, especially women. Can these be brought more, the question is, how can these groups be brought more openly into the conversation?
I think we need to see the connection between issues, right? That and one of those is just what I keep referring to as an intersectional approach, which is when we're talking about women, we have to be clear about like which women are we talking about and who are we leaving out of the discussion. And some of the issues that Nwabisa is talking about, like economic justice and dealing with gender violence, are still very much an issue in the United States. and they disproportionately impact groups of color, including Indigenous women. And so when we are talking about some of these broader issues, we need to make sure that we're talking about all of the groups that are impacted and those that are disproportionately impacted by it. And so, you know, if we're talking about gender justice and a fight for gender equality, are we bringing up the issues of Indigenous women, of Black women, of Latinas, you know, of Asian American women, and that those issues that are sometimes seen as separate are very much a part of that same struggle. And so we really need to broaden our conversation to make sure that we're paying attention to which groups are being left out when we're talking about advances and rights.
Thank you. And we had over 100 questions here. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but our time is running out. I'm going to pass it back to you, Noelle.
Thanks so much, Dave. Well, there obviously are a lot of areas where there still is room for progress, and I want to talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But first off, I just wanted to let our viewers know that we've listed a number of resources in the chat screen of this webinar. So that will include a link to our Beyond the Vote series page, where you can find all of the monitor's coverage on the suffrage centennial, including a video where 3 generations of women in one family share what voting means to them. So to view that link, you click the little chat button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. But before we go, I have one last question that I'd like to pose to each of you. And so, as we've talked about, it's pretty undeniable that society has come a very long way in the past century, but it is also undeniable that there is yet to go. We have more work to do. And social change it's a process that often feels like it comes with just as many setbacks as it does leaps forward. So where do each of you look when you're feeling like you need a bit of hope for the future, to see that and really want to feel that we are continuing to move forward? And this is really for all of you. So I'm not sure which of you might like to speak up first.
Okay, I can go first.
Great.
I don't know if I would refer to it sort of as hope, but one of the things that motivates me about the future, and you know, to kind of invest in the future and work as hard as we can, you know, socially to create a better future, is really because I'm a mother, and it's that responsibility that I feel that I have to contribute to a better tomorrow, because my view is I would like my son to grow up in a better world than I grew up. I'd like him to function, you know, in better systems than the ones that I found. So I'm always, you know, even when I feel down and I feel like I can't do this anymore. But for me, you know, it's almost like that burden, and it's a burden of love. It's a burden in me that says you've got to create a better world for him than that which you found. And I think that for me is really kind of the inspiration behind everything that I do.
Well, that's great, Nwabisa. I think many of you would probably say that you find some motivation from your children. But how about you, Celeste? Where do you see hope? Do your students offer it to you, perhaps, or are there other areas that you look?
They absolutely do. But I talk to them a lot about how we talk about a lot of hard things. We talk about oppression, you know, we talk about inequality in the classes, but I always focus at the end on social movements, because although people often paint social movements as kind of as angry and cynical and disruptive, social movements are inherently hopeful. You have to believe, like Nwabisa was saying, you have to believe that a better future is possible. You have to believe that there's a better world out there in order to take the risks that activists do, that social justice movements do. And when I see all these young youth activists mobilizing on a range of issues, from the environment to racial justice, that this gives me hope. This gives me hope that they see that future too, and that they're willing to take the risks to fight for it. Because as Jane said, you know, you're not given anything, you have to fight for it and earn it. And that's what they're doing, and that's what I'm doing, and that we need more of that if we want to get to that brighter future.
Oh, thank you, Celeste. And Jane, how about you? So you've watched this trajectory over the last 100 years. So where do you have hope for the future, for the next 100?
Well, I'll just, a Greek quote, they thought they had buried us, but we were seeds. We are seeds, and we are seeds, and they may be buried, but by golly, we are going to sprout. I feel very hopeful. I'm very hopeful. Just that we're having this conversation. It never happened in my childhood that we talk like this. This is all to the good, and we're making progress. And the things aren't going to be given to us. We are going to earn them and take them ourselves. That's my saying.
I love that idea that, especially in sort of thinking about as, progress often has fits and starts, and to remember that when there are setbacks that the
Yeah,
seeds have been planted, and just because they haven't sprouted yet doesn't mean they won't.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really just a wonderful sentiment. Well, I really want to thank all of you, but before our audience signs off, I just want to let everyone know that tomorrow we'll be having a special guest on our private women's leadership Facebook page, author Elaine Weiss, who wrote the book The Woman's Hour: The Great Fight to Win the Vote. Will be answering questions at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday. So hopefully you can join us. And if you haven't already, you can join this invitation only Facebook page on the link in the chat section right now. And we're also going to be sending out an email with a survey about today's webinar, and we would really appreciate your feedback. So we'd love to hear from you. And so I just want to say thank you to Nwabisa Makunga, Celeste Montoya, and Jane Curtis for joining us today. It has been such a pleasure to hear a bit of each of your stories. You bring such distinct perspectives. It's really been interesting to see, although you come from very different parts of the world and backgrounds, where your ideas merge together. And it's been really just wonderful. Thank you. And a big thanks to Dave Scott for fielding audience questions and comments. And I'd also like to thank our events team, led by Promotion and Events Manager Lauren Crandall, producer Greg Fitzgerald, along with Lena Carlson and Cortland Reedskin. The Monitor's product owner is Kim Proctor. Thank you so much for joining us today.